What did your dad and dad do for a living?
Dad was a country doctor.
Mm-hmm.
He practiced in Cuba, New York, and
Was he from Cuba? Was
he was from Shingle House.
Oh, okay.
So he was a product of the area and returned after his education. Mom was a teacher. She went to Mansfield State and she returned. She lived in Bradford. Her parents lived there, and they were my maternal grandparents, who I spent the summers with during the Second World War. Mm. And then I can remember many good times having with them. I took a trip just 3 weeks ago. It had a nice summer day, and Jane had a bridge club coming in, so I took a wander over to Cuba and then to Shingle House to look up the gravesite of my grandparents, and wandered from there over to Duke Center, and over the Looker Mountain Trail was named after my great-grandfather, John C. Looker.
No kidding.
And then down into East Bradford and right down to the old homestead. Got out of the car and saw a tree that I nicked up with a little hatchet when I was a kid. Wow. The scars are still on the tree. But it was kind of nostalgic and kind of fun to do. But I was a product of the area.
Yeah.
And I always have looked at Western New York, North Central Pennsylvania as our home. And it's been a two-way street. I've been rewarded for doing that and have enjoyed it.
Cuba, New York. Were you a high school graduate there?
Yes.
What year?
Class of '56, valedictorian.
And was there any question in your mind that from there, where'd you go to college after that?
Bucknell.
Bucknell.
I was definitely in Dad's footsteps.
Ah.
He was a Bucknell graduate of '33. And I was going to be a physician, follow in his footsteps, and gave him a call my junior year in the fall. I said, Dad, let's meet in Wellsboro. I have to talk to you. I knew it just wasn't for me, and I'd had the fun of being involved in student politics. I was class president and had been very active in that kind of stuff, and all of a sudden I didn't like the histology and genealogy professor in the bioscience that we had, the little gruff gal by the name of Hilda McElhays, and she thinned me right out. I said, Dad, I gotta do something else. So I decided to finish off in secondary education. I had a lot of hours in English and in biology, and so I had a dual major and finished out that way. And it wasn't until my senior year when fraternity brothers said, hey, come on, we're going to take the LSAT. Why don't you join us? Well, I took the LSAT with them, and I got the second highest mark of anybody in Bucknell. Wow. So I thought, wow, maybe I should do something here, but I didn't do anything, and I was going to teach math in Messina, New York. But I received a call from Fitz Walling, who was the alumni director and the admissions officer for Bucknell, and he said, Tyke, I just had Bob Newhart, not Newhart, but Newman, who was the assistant director of admissions, take the position of being director of admissions for Penn State. And so it left a hole in his office, and he said, do you want to come down and work with me this summer? So on August 20th, when I was supposed to report August 21st in Messina, I decided to go back to Bucknell and be assistant director of admissions. And I was there for a year and a half and enjoyed that very much. But along came the Berlin crisis. Mm-hmm. And it was, for me, a question of whether or not I wanted to enlist in the AOC program or maybe go on to graduate school. And the decision was made when the Johnson administration made the required enlistment period 6 years instead of 4 years. So I looked and said, gee, maybe I should do something with that law score I had. And that was August 21st. And the start of classes was the next week. So I toured and went to Syracuse, and I went to Albany Law. Just walked in cold, and I walked in and met Dean Hessen, Samuel D. Hessen. He was the dean of the Albany Law School, and he was just a wonderful gentleman. He was very good. He wrote the practice commentaries to the CPLR because it was just a new statute at that time, but he was immersed in civil procedure, and yet he had a very keen awareness of the needs for each of the students. And he said, sure, report next week, which I did. And from there on, I became an attorney. Not without a return to Dean Hessen my senior year. Because...
Just for the camera, that was Syracuse, right?
No, Albany Law. Albany Law.
Albany Law,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. And my senior year, I had taken Fridays and Monday mornings off because Jane and I could make a lot of money by my returning to her hometown of Danville, Pennsylvania, where I had been a Ready Light salesman for the Pennsylvania Power and Light Company during the summer. I started out the 1st of July working for PP&L, and they had hired school teachers for the summer to do that. Well, the teachers were doing their yeoman job, going farm to farm and door to door, but I looked at the area and said, we need to put Ready Lights on all these industrial parking lots. So I would write up a contract for 20 or 30 lights, and then by the end of August, I was leading everybody in all of the PP&L area and making quite a bit of money at the time. Yeah. So I kept on trying to do that as law school came on, and in December, Dean Hessen, before the holidays, said, stop by and talk to me, would you please? And he asked me to take a semester off and see what I really wanted to do. So I went back and worked for PP&L and enjoyed a good full half year working for PP&L and doing a good job, I think, with that whole program. And lo and behold, about the middle of August the next year, my mother called and said, you know, you have a letter here from Albany Law School and we haven't opened it. Do you think you should look at it? And I said, it's out of sight, out of mind, and I hadn't thought of it. And it said, we would be glad to welcome you back to finish your senior year if you wish to do so. Yeah. Please contact us. Well, that was deliverance and the ray of light and the skies opening and Gabriel blowing the horn and everything. So it was kind of fun to go back, and I just tore the place up and did very well that.
When you were at Albany, just as kind of a side note, was the name Jackson even part of
yes.
the conversation? There
was a lecture series that had been endowed, and I'm not sure the source of the endowment other than the general alumni. Okay. But there was the Robert H. Jackson lecture series that was very good. It brought in Supreme Court justices and outstanding people in the field of various fields of law. And they would provide, I think, 3 lectures a year that were very good for just, you know, the integration of law and the current legal topics into the curriculum and the exposure to the students.
Also, just a sidebar, you were born probably around 1938?
Yes.
And do you have recollections of the time during World War II?
Yes.
What's your recollections? Was your family caught up in that at all?
My dad was a base physician at Hampton Roads before he shipped out on the 6th Fleet into the Pacific. And he was in on Okinawa and Iwo Jima and Tokyo Bay as a ship physician. And he was anchored offshore, but actually ran the equivalent of a base hospital
Right.
for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. And he said it was just the most devastating thing he'd ever seen. He brought back small Japanese potteries of sake glasses and sake bowls that he received. He got those. He got one at Hiroshima, and he had a radiometer, and that thing would just buzz because of its exposure.
Do you remember in Cuba, New York, VJ Day, war ends? You would have been, maybe
Yes.
7 years old.
Yes, standing on the side of the street, early summer evening. It was the VJ Day. Band, huge throngs of people walking up and down the streets, just delirious and happy. And I was 8 years old at the time. VE Day, I don't remember victory in Europe. It was early April.
Right, correct.
I remember the sense that there was something that had happened, but I don't really remember that as vividly as VJ Day.
Who was your mom's? You're at home. Your mom with your mom. Who else was with you? Do you have siblings?
Not at that time.
Okay.
When I was 13, my sister Lynn was born.
Okay. So you're an only child. You're with your mom. How was she coping with this? Dad's gone.
She was teaching English at the local high school.
Yeah.
And she had to return to that because in 1960, the year that I graduated from Bucknell, Dad had a stroke. And he, at that time, was right at the height of his practice and career, but that limited their income, and so she returned and taught for about 12 to 14 more years. And a lot of people enjoyed talking about Mrs. Bly as their English teacher. But I was always proud of her. And she was not a warm person, but she was a wonderfully interesting person. She realized the importance of stimulating a person's curiosity. And I think that's one of the driving forces of knowledge and experience, and curiosity drives both you and me and a lot of good working people.
So we now have you graduating from Albany Law, and now you got prospects. You dabbled in the business world, and then you might decide to practice law. How was that decision made?
I haven't thought of that. There was a period of time when I was undecided what I wanted to do. In Cuba, New York, we had a very interesting character. Very few people really understood him as well as I did, but his name was Carl Farner. And Carl Farner was the ski jumper, the Nordic the ski jumper of the 1928 German Olympic team that came to Lake Placid.
Okay.
He settled in Buffalo because his sister had previously migrated from Germany to there, but Carl settled in Buffalo and worked many years in the steel mill until he accumulated enough money to buy a sawmill. And he bought a sawmill in the Honeoye Valley just north of Shingle House. And he turned that into being one of the most productive sawmills in the whole of the north end of the Allegheny Forest. He realized the importance of a bandsaw. A bandsaw would provide a narrow kerf, or the cut that a saw makes in a log. And by doing it, he could increase his yields by between 5 and 10% over a conventional circular saw.
Yeah.
And he bought veneer logs and produced some of the very highest quality lumber for the furniture industry. And Carl enjoyed sailing. And so I was his first mate for many, many years, and we became very close friends. He and his wife, Lois, had a beautiful alpine chalet overlooking Cuba Lake up on a bluff on a hill. And he became an uncle. True spirit and kind and an uncle. But he said, boy, you should be an attorney. He was the first guy that put it in my mind, even before I graduated from school. And it kind of evolved that I wanted to come back to this area. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, Carl Farner knew Dick and Lillian Condon from Salamanca, New York. Yeah. And so Dick talked to me my senior year of law school and said, well, we would have a position for you if you would be interested in it. And he and Ben Perot and his father, Charlie Condon, who was an octogenarian, wonderful old man, would they had a practice in the Salamanca Trust Company on the second floor, and I went there after law school. And one thing led to another. Interesting thing, Greg, at that time the economics were enough so that a starting salary of $50 a week was what Jane and I lived on with 2 children, and getting things started. So that was our humble beginning story. And
so you're with Condon and Perot,
yeah.
And the office is still there. I was recently there with and interviewed Bert Dole.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah. And,
wonderful.
And
yeah.
I have a picture I'll show you later of the Bar Association, and in the front row was a very young-looking Loren Bly.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So Condon, Perot, and so you had the 2 Condons at the time, and Ben Perot. And what they have you do? Is it just soup to nuts?
Soup to nuts, kind of. But Ben asked me to take over the collection practice. Okay. I knew nothing about the applied work of an attorney having to draw up a summons and a complaint and serve and appear at the return date before a judge to talk about the merits of the case that you had. And it was the best education I ever had. It really was good. I don't know, someplace along the line I got lucky though. I ran into the mentor of my real career was Jim Kehoe. Leighton Wade had retired. He retired to go to Arizona to be the counsel for the Arizona State Bar Association, okay. Which he did. And that left a hole in what was Wade and Kehoe. And Jimmy Kehoe came to Ben Perot, said, do you mind if I talk to Loren? And Ben said, no, fine. And sure enough, it was a return to Olean, which was closer to Cuba, which meant something back in those days. And Jim was smart enough to give me my head, and I'll never forget the second day that I was with him, he said, come on in the office tonight about 7. So So I went into the office about 7. He said, here's a file. At 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, you have to be in city court, and there's return date on this. You just be ready to represent the plaintiff. That was called jumping in with both feet, and it was a good experience.
Again, soup to nuts practice?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With a specialty, Jim and Leighton had developed a wonderful representation of the automotive liability insurance industry. And it was in the age of where contributory negligence was still an available defense. And that really was an easy thing to prove. There's always contributory negligence of some degree involved in an accident or a liability claim. So it was easy to go on and succeed and do quite well at that.
So but early on there was a lot of litigation, a lot of collections, defense work, all of that stuff, which got you into court.
Yes.
Later on, we kind of knew you much more as a business transaction lawyer representing corporations. How did that sort of? Well, maybe we should continue on your tour of law firms. I mean, you had that, and
I was only with Jim.
Jim, okay.
At the same time, in Olean, this was now 1968.
Okay.
Yeah, in '68, Jane and I went to Olean from Salamanca. And at the same time, a young man who was an accountant returned to Olean because his hometown was Allegheny, New York, and he was a new young CPA, and his name was Fran Wienog. And so Fran and I met in '68, and from there on we had a lifelong friendship, which we still enjoy. And it's been a main thread of my business and personal development was my association with Fran. I would do the legal services, and he would provide the accounting services for new startup businesses. Well, about that same time, you may know from your background, there was an agency that was developed in Western New York called the Chautauqua County Industrial Development Agency. And by good foresight, wisdom, Paul Sandberg and the board acquired an Altec grant to develop the facilities of the Allegheny Ludlam spin-off up in Dunkirk. And the money became a revolving loan fund. Well, that was manna, because nobody had a source of capital between the 80% worth that a bank would lend against and the 100% need for a young startup business. But that thrived, and it was fostered and encouraged and developed very well by Paul, and his assistant, or his executive director, was David Dawson. And we befriended Dave, and Dave enjoyed working with us, and so we moved and opened our first joint offices together in the Furniture Mart building in 1970.
No kidding.
And that's where we began our practice in Chautauqua County.
Now, at the time, the practice was Loren Bly.
Yeah, Loren Bly, attorney at law.
So it was you.
Yeah.
Did you at the time you had offices in Olean in here?
No.
Or just here?
I closed my offices in Olean and moved over here, although I had an office building on 201 Berry Street, which I kept for about 5 years.
So here you are. You're in Jamestown, New York,
Jamestown,
1970s, and with befriending the Wienogs, the Dawsons, Paul Sandbergs, you're starting to acclimate into the Jamestown community. So, who were some of the lawyers that you kind of connected with early? You're a guy from Olean, And not that people were overly cliquey, but still it was pretty parochial.
It was parochial, and I was probably one of the first people to make a lateral transfer within the southern tier.
Over the furniture market.
One of the first people that I met was Lou Ledestro. Lou was a boisterous, good, hail fellow, well-met person, and he said, "I'm going to keep my eye on you," because I was an outsider.
Yeah.
And yet we hit it off, and that led to meeting Joe Gerasi and Willard Cass. Willard and I became quite close because we had already met when I was in my 5th year of practice in Olean. I was president of the Cattaraugus County Bar at the same time that Willard was the president of the Chautauqua County Bar.
No kidding.
And so I asked him over to Cattaraugus County Bar meeting.
Keep talking. I'm going to look for your picture here.
Yeah.
Yes, no, go ahead.
Yeah, and well, we had a bar association meeting up at the Coachman in Little Valley. And Willard came over, and it was quite a hit that he would meet and talk to the bar association, and I reciprocated and came over here one night.
Still, you're a guy from Olean coming to the Jamestown Bar Association, 1970.
Yeah.
You know, that's you're in the furniture mart building. Was Art there? Was he?
Yes, Art Bailey was on the next floor above.
Okay.
Art had, at that time, a very prominent personal injury practice, and he considered himself to be quite adept.
Erickson, Webb, and Skolton were at the time, were Erickson, Webb, I guess it was called then?
Yeah, Erickson, Webb, they were there. I'm trying to think. I'm sorry I have to look. There's Paul Webb. Greg Yaw was there with Brian York. He was in the Furniture Mart building.
Did you have? Oh, go ahead.
Ward Westerberg was there also. He was with Johnson Peterson, Diener, and Anderson.
Good memory. Good memory.
Yeah.
Was there somebody here in the Jamestown Bar, again, I'm back to the parochialism, who you sort of latched onto to sort of help you work your way through the personalities that were here? Since you're right, I think you were probably one of the first lateral people to kind of float in and be part, be part of this.
Even before the Buffalo offices began to open up branches, we were here by about 5 years.
Yeah.
On that. Greg, I don't want to, there was no one mentor that I ran into that I felt I had. I think I was on my feet enough that I had to rely on my own sense of well-being and conscience. And I did that.
So that meant really to integrate into the community was really then through the business side. I mean, that's a Fran Weena, but even Fran was a person who was from Olean. Yeah. And the kind of the BWB building, which we're in now, and that whole relationship, I don't know that it was here yet, 1970. So really through Sandberg, Dawson, and talk about Paul Bush. I mean, at some point,
Paul became our main thread, I think, because in working with the Chautauqua County Industrial Development Agency, they had just completed the South Park IDA site, and the industrial development park that goes off of not Jones and Gifford, but the main.
It's Allen Street.
Allen Street,
Yeah,
yes.
Mason Industrial
Yeah.
Park,
I just remember being awed because I knew that Paul was right at the point where he was about to explode out of Little Valley, and I did not want him to go to Olean. And I knew the advantage that the IDA had with the grant that could come from the agency. Well, I spoke to David and Paul and said, could we possibly entice Paul Bush to come over? And I know that we had a luncheon where we sat down, and then Dave and Paul and I toured the industrial development site, and it was an immediate love at first sight.
How did you meet with Paul? I mean, how did you guys connect? Were you just kind of buddies from the Olean area?
I think, Paul.
Yeah.
Paul and Brian Erickson and I were of the same general age group. And when I was in Salamanca, they had returned Paul to Little Valley to build up Bush Industries at the Little Valley plant, and Brian to return to Fancher Industries with his father and work
okay.
that up. So we've been lifelong friends. We began our nexus of movement and work from that point. And it was a natural thing for us. Then I introduced David to them as well. And Dave and Paul hit it off quite well. And Dave and Paul and Fran and I had many good sessions where we'd do some planning, and it always would fulfill the plan. And there were successive financings until the agency just wasn't able to continue to fully service the needs that Bush Industries had as it was growing. But that led to a good banking relationship with Erky Calborn and the First Trust Union.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to a takeout by the M&T.
Okay.
And so in the first 10 years, from about 1970 to 1980, we not only had brought Bush Industries in, but it had built the original plant and then the addition, and made it the basic source of all panel stock and packing and assembly for Bush Industries.
You must have a sense of pride. Watch that.
Oh, absolutely.
Here's an idea, a concept. Where here's
Yeah.
an emerging business in Little Valley, but to have the foresight to bring it here. Was there competition from? Was at the time, at the early stages, was Erie a potential location, or was it always sort of Chautauqua County?
It was always Cattaraugus County versus Chautauqua County.
Okay.
I had my office in at 107 South Berry Street, and Paul came over for a meeting one morning, and Fran was there, and he was running and became president of Bush Brothers Products Corp.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, I just don't like this Bush Brothers Products Corp. What should we do? And I said, well, let's form Bush Industries. He said, done. And so that was it. It was a start. But I had the pleasure of naming the thing. It was, Paul had the foresight of seeing not only how a product would be developed and manufactured, but he really had an instinct for where it could be mass marketed, which would justify large production runs of the materials that make it economic to produce and sell.
What was Paul's background? Was he an engineer?
He was an engineer from MIT, or I'm sorry, not MIT, but RPI.
Okay.
Yeah, he graduated and came back then to help his dad and his uncles in the Bush Brothers Products Corp. There was a cousin who was in there who was the golden-haired boy of the head of the old original Bush brothers, and Simon Bush was the father and the kind of the titular head of the Bush brothers of the 1940s and 50s. They had a plating business, and
Yeah, I remember that.
yeah, so it was. But Bob Bush was another member of his generation. So Paul and Bob shared offices at Bush Brothers Products Corporation, and Bob had, I think he had a 50% profit incentive given to him, and Paul always enjoyed the story of telling at the end of the first year, Bob got his dividend check at a 50% profit level. For the business he brought in, he got $37.50. But Paul, on the other hand, just took off with some of the things. He had the job, well, it was the cabinet that would mount over a toilet in a bathroom with two poles sticking up through it that were spring-loaded to hold them in place. And that was his first product.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was a cumbersome thing. It had plating all up and down the pole, but the box was panel stock, 4 sides,
Yeah.
and the front sliding. And he had to run the saws and cut up in dimension stock the proper configuration of panels, and he really became good at that. He did the first calculations and worked right straight through. Paul had he was lucky in one other accord. Don Houck was a young clerk or accountant, and Don and Judy Houck went with Paul as quickly as he decided to build Bush Industries. And they had both been in the accounting department of Bush Brothers Products Corp. And Don's contribution was solid. I mean, he would take ideas that Fran and the CPA firm would give them and implement them. But he kept the day-to-day books at the corporation and did a very good job, and Judy did also.
Just an aside, is Don still living on, is it Hunt Road?
I think so. Yeah, I haven't seen Don in a couple of years, honestly. I'm sorry.
Me neither, because I used to see him on the basketball court.
Yeah, he was a good official.
Exactly. So were there other instances I know, of your close relationship with Bush Industries? Were there other type organizations which because that became your ilk. All of a sudden, you're not a litigator. You're kind of a business developer.
Yeah. I'm trying to think what's best. I mentioned Brian Erickson. Brian and Leonard needed financing for Fancher as it went along, and we expanded their needs and serviced their needs for a number of years.
Which is Fancher chair, Fancher furniture, Fancher clock.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fancher Clock was a kind of a unique corporation, as you know, because the product was an artistic old grandfather clock that was built in Bavaria, imported, and cabinets were made in Salamanca and put together in Salamanca and shipped all over the United States. Very good quality. We still have ours.
Did you find did you miss the litigation part of it, where all of a sudden you're kind of the business?
I recognized the dilemma, Greg, of being either a litigator or a business attorney, because if you're going to be a business attorney, you have to be able to respond to your client's needs daily. and as they occur. Or if you're going to be a litigator, you have to commit to being at the primary call of the presiding judge at the term of court that's in session. And the two don't mix. They conflicted, so it was another reason that justified Fran and I setting up our businesses and working together.
Having launched in that direction, and being by yourself, was there ever an inclination that you'd say, always good to have somebody I can bounce ideas off who's a fellow lawyer? Were other combinations ever, I know you ultimately did, but during that time period ever thought of?
In Olean, I had Mike Adams and George Bradley as partners, and they were with me for 2 to 3 years. So we did have a small firm, but it was a good thing. George Bradley had a wonderful perspective, and he was a very valuable associate partner, mentor, good friend. I mean, strangely enough, George was 12 years younger than I was, but he has a maturity about him that you can know just by meeting him and talking with him. And he was very helpful. Over here, after we had been practicing for a number of years, I ran into Paul Andrews and talked with Paul. Mm-hmm. Paul was working part-time with Lanny Sheffield, and he introduced me to Lanny, and one day we sat down and said, well, why don't we give it a try? And so that's when we bought the corner property at 6th and Lakeview.
The old Wellman house.
The old Wellman house, that's exactly right. And that was a wonderful office for us. Good base of operation, and gave us the privacy and the status of an independent office. It was more than just an office in the Furniture Mart building.
You also cast your lot with, or got involved with oil and gas and other things. Who drew you in that direction?
My great-grandfather, John C. Looker. My grandfather sold his leases in the Bradford area after he'd gotten off. He developed them during his lifetime. He got off the boat from Scotland with a proverbial farthing in his pocket and turned it into $1 million paycheck when he sold his leases in 1927.
I'll be darned.
An attorney that was a very active, aggressive attorney that represented him, reinvested him and leveraged him at the time in 1927 and 28 in a number of real good prospects in the Bradford area, and the Depression came along, and sorrowfully he died the day that I was born. But his daughter, my grandmother, and her husband actually had Grandpa Looker live with them the last 2 years of his life. And yet the stories of the wealth in the Bradford field that they had been exposed to and that they could have from oil and gas, which was then further developed in me by the fact that during the Second World War, as I said, Dad shipped out of the Seattle naval base as part of the 7th Fleet. I think it was the 7th Fleet on the USS Tolan. And Mom would go out and spend the time with him prior to their departure, and I stayed with my grandmother and grandfather, Lewis, on Lower East Main in Bradford. And Grandpa, because of the war, was acting as a lease supervisor. And so I would walk the leases with him and see the old walking beams and the powerhouses and hear the thump, 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 thump of the old one-cylinder lease engine, and it just is something that if you experience it at that age and in that light, it gets in your blood.
Wow.
And I always remembered, and still to this minute, can smell the first real whiff of crude oil that I had as a boy. It was right at a well site, and it squirted right at the pillow box,
Yeah.
at the top of the suction rod. Anyway, it squirted and it got on my shirt, and I didn't mind it. I just, But that led to my realization that there was something going on. There was a play that occurred in Chautauqua County, New York. As I was coming here, all of a sudden people began to talk about the Bass Island trend. There was a fault line that had potential for huge volumes of oil right here in Chautauqua County, and I began to get very interested in it. And my musings and involvement in the Bass Island weren't quite so successful, but they led me to learn that all of a sudden there may be a huge, tremendous potential for acreage in central Pennsylvania, because there was a new formation called the Marcellus Shale that is being defined as being possibly a great reservoir for oil and gas. And boy, did I jump on that. It was just a natural thing because my brother-in-law was a member of a hunting club in central Lycoming County that had 5,000 acres next to another hunting club that had 3,000 acres next to another hunting club that had another 2,000 to 4,000 acres, and we put them all together into a big package. I enticed Anadarko Petroleum from Denver, Colorado to come east of the Mississippi and develop that, and they did it. They not only developed it, but they not only leased it on good terms for the landowner that we negotiated, but we also made sure they had a development commitment. That's the thing I think I added to that. I made sure that there was a development commitment in the lease that proved successful. And oh my God.
That was
Jerry.
at Bert's office.
Yep, Jerry Moriarty. Who the hell was he? I forget. Ross Peters. Tragic.
Yeah, what happened?
We lost Ross. He had a aneurysm, and he died at a young age. He was a New York State track star,
Yeah.
but he passed away. That was about 20 years ago.
Peters and Platts, wasn't it?
Yep. And Ross worked also with me in the Olean office.
Okay.
He was a very, very good head. He was law review.
Yeah, that was, I saw that, I said, my God, that is Loren Bly, you're the youngest guy in the whole room. At least the youngest looking in the whole room.
Well, thank you.
So you're with Bly, Sheffield, Andrews, and at some point you have these outside interests. You're always good at sort of doing additional opportunities. But was it hard at some point to say, I want to get out of the practice of law?
I recognized that I had not been successful to the extent of being able to provide a capital base for retirement. And I was troubled by that, by that time. And all of a sudden I realized that if in fact we could have the production revenue from natural gas and oil being produced from a property, an overriding royalty was a natural reward for the leasing agent that put the transaction together, and that's what I worked for. And I worked towards, and it became the retirement base that Jane and I presently enjoy. I'm so thankful that it proved itself.
Well, good foresight on your part. That's, well, you've always had a gift for a presentation. I mean, you've been very articulate. I've seen you often, and but that's a gift you have of abilities to take a situation, articulate it, sell it.
Yeah, and see what its potential might be.
Yeah.
It's I've enjoyed process manufacturing. If I have a young fellow who has a new idea, I want to see his process and see how he's managing the material flow or the information flow that it takes to make his effective contribution.
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
No, I don't want to.
Okay.
I'm here with you, man.
Oh.
This is the highlight of highlight of the day.
Yeah, well, no. Well, I see a lot of old faces here.
Any names as you're looking down that, you were starting to talk about Jim Abdallah. When I interrupted you, I said, don't start talking until we have the camera on. Do you have a vignette with Jim?
Jim and I became very good friends. Unfortunately, there was one time when I got a little tight and I wasn't able to pay my debts when they became due. And I was really in a tight bind, and I said to Jim, I'm going to have to make a deal with you. And I kept the deal with him, and he kept his word with me, and we worked everything out. And we always were good friends after that.
Sure.
Steve was his son, and I thought Steve was a very lucky guy to have his dad be his mentor.
Were you ever involved in politics at all, Loren?
No.
Yeah.
I learned my lesson in college. I did not like the committee process that you have to go through for a political decision. And you know, Greg, I'm troubled. I really think that that's the limitation that we have in this day of instant expectations of making the democratic process really still effective in dealing with current problems. We have to convene the hearings, and we have to have the findings, and we have to publish them, and we have to adopt them or modify them or let them sit in committee for a while. It doesn't lend to swift, speedy decision. Not that I favor totalitarianism, but I certainly don't think that we're able to stay abreast of our needs as well as we should be.
Because you're in from that entrepreneurial world where the CEO has an idea, he may muse a little bit, like Fran, we talk to Fran, talk to Loren, and then make a decision and go.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my world, your world.
Yep.
And to see that there's a process that will ultimately lead to its death because of it just gets burdened down by a strategic plan, let's
right.
get everybody talking.
You're right.
That's an interesting thing. When people come up and they see you as a senior attorney, if they come up and ask you for advice of whether to even get into the practice of law, what might you tell them?
I would encourage them to pursue their interests in law. But my dad gave me, I think, the best advice I ever had. He told me my beginning year, when I was home one day, he said, Tyke, just remember that every person you deal with who's going to be your customer or your client is going to be dealing with you with their most important problem of the time. And you need to give them that respect. And so I think if a person is willing to be a problem solver and work for the best interest of somebody, they're going to make a decision. You and I have both known many attorneys, some of whom are on this page, Greg, who are afraid to make a decision. And if you don't make the decision, you don't move forward. You only tread water or backwater. I never was a backwater.
Well, you've been so successful on so many other fronts, and Of course, we worked a lot with IDA information
Oh,
stuff,
yeah.
and of course, through my wife at Bush Industries.
Yes, Cindy was a great help to Paul, and she did a wonderful job carrying on a day-to-day basis where I did not want to commit myself.
Yeah.
And but it was great for her, and I think she enjoyed it.
Yeah.
You've always been a very wonderful contributor to the community. It's instinctive with you. That's what makes it so natural and so good. And that's something that we appreciate, and I was happy to come in today to talk a little.
Well, your value added on so many fronts, Loren, so I'm delighted before you head south to get you here while we could. And you look great. I know you went through a little bit of a health exercise recently, and but you look good.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm at 83, I'm doing well. Probably won't make 100, but I'll be happy to. I'm a happy person, Greg. I've lived a good life. I've made some contributions, and I have 3 great children and 8 great grandchildren and 2 legitimate great-grandchildren.
And it's a good thing you married well.
Yes, Janie has been a good spouse.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.